Well, good evening. Good to see everybody this evening. Take out your Bibles and turn to 1 Kings chapter 17. That's where we're going to take off just right where we left off this morning. Hope that you all had a good afternoon. I know that most of you did, just as I did. It was good to be with you all and get together this afternoon. Appreciate Jim and also Jessica opening up their home to us. It was a very enjoyable time. Larry and I spoke at the table of how good it is for us to be able to enjoy such food. What a blessing it is. So many of the people in the world aren't able to enjoy just the good cooking that we were able to enjoy this afternoon. But more importantly, it was good to be together with brethren and encourage one another. And it's always encouraging to see a congregation being together, enjoying each other's company, enjoying what the Lord has blessed us with. And it's good for us to be here to eat this evening, to feast not on physical food but spiritual food. And so hopefully we will gain much from the Word of God this evening and let it speak to us. The story is told of a man who was walking across the road one day, and he was hit by a car, knocked out, went into a coma for a couple of days, and he finally regained consciousness. And when he woke up, he opened his eyes, and his loving wife was right there beside him, holding his hand. And he said, "You know, Judy, you've always been there right by my side the whole life. When we were back in college and I was failing every single subject, you were there right beside me saying that I could do this. And when I got out of school and I went for all my interview for all these jobs and I failed to get each and every one of those jobs, you stood right beside me and said, one day." Then I started work at this little firm and finally got the big chance to handle this huge contract, and I made one little mistake and I failed the whole thing. And through it all, you were right there by my side. And I said, now I've been in this accident. I woke up. You are the first person that I see, and there's something I would really like to tell you. Judy, I think you're just plain bad luck. And you know, I can't help but wonder if sometimes we think of God that way. That every time something bad happens, God is right there beside us. He is right there trying to help us get through things. And yet those times, instead of appreciating that, we maybe intentionally blame God for some of the things that we go through in this life. And I think there's a woman here in 1 Kings chapter 17 who does exactly that. That Elijah is God's representative, and he is right beside her. God is with her through all of this. And one day, her son has a terrible tragedy that we're going to read about here. And that changes everything. And she's wondering, where is this so-called God? And so tonight, I want us to look at that story and see the lessons that are there for us. But what I want to do, again, is go back and set the scene for us. Because as I mentioned, we're going to take up right where we left off this morning. Elijah was a prophet of God who was sent to King Ahab by the one true God of Israel, Yahweh. And he tells them that you're going to go through a period of difficulty because of your wickedness and through all that has been going on, all that you've been leading them to do. And through the influence of Ahab and his wicked wife, Jezebel, you remember that Israel had started worshiping Baal and Asherah, who were the foreign gods of the Sidonians. And so in order to punish them, God was going to do exactly what he said he was going to do back in Deuteronomy chapter 11, and that is to stop all rain and dew upon the earth. And that's exactly what happened. For 3.5 years, it did not rain. And it's hard to imagine how difficult that is, isn't it? We are blessed today as we are getting rain, but we all acknowledge that this rain is much needed because there has been a drought even here and in most of the eastern United States. But this is nothing compared to what Elijah and the Israelites were going through all of that time. Imagine 3 years without rain. After a couple of months, King Ahab probably issued a decree and said that there is no use watering anything. I mean, there was anyone who's caught watering their lawns or washing their chariots, they're going to be fined accordingly. And after a few more months, nobody's allowed to wash their clothes or take a bath. And after 3 years, you can't even find any water to drink. Now remember that Ahab and Jezebel didn't take kindly to Elijah's words. And so as months went by without rain, they are sending these search parties out everywhere, searching for Elijah. They want Elijah's head. But God protected Elijah. You'll remember by hiding him in the mountains, by the brook Kerith, feeding him with bread and meat twice a day from these ravens. And we learned this morning the importance of trusting in God, that God will always take care of us if we are faithful to him, that he will provide the things that we need. It may not always be the things that we want, but it is always the things that we need. We learn that God may not always take care of us the way that we think that he ought to take care of us, but we do know that God takes care of us. And what we're going to learn tonight is that God does that again in this situation. That there wasn't much at the brook of Kerith. And after months and months now without rain, what verse 7 tells us that even the brook was drying up. And so Elijah had to go somewhere else. And that's what this passage is about this evening. I want us to take up in verse 8 where it says, "Then the word of Yahweh came to him, to Elijah, saying, Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there." Now, this must have sounded like one of those good news, bad news jokes. Because here the Lord says to him, the good news is, Elijah, I want you to leave Kerith. The bad thing is, I want you to go to Zarephath. And I don't know how much Elijah knew about geography. It's possible that he had never heard of Zarephath before, because it's a small town along the Mediterranean coast that is in the land of the Phoenicians. It was a Gentile area. It's outside of Israel. It is part of the Sidonian. In fact, it was a small village right outside of Sidon, as verse 9 says, that belongs to Sidon. And so Elijah might not have heard of Zarephath before, but you are sure that he has heard of Sidon, because you remember, go back to the previous chapter we talked about early this morning, that's exactly where Jezebel comes from. That is Jezebel's hometown, the capital of Phoenicia. So it is the center of Baal worship and Asherah worship. That's exactly where God is sending Elijah. Now, why in the world would God send Elijah to Zarephath, the suburb of this pagan place, this suburb of Sidon? It didn't make any sense. And I don't know about you, but if I was Elijah, I would be tempted here to ask some questions. Lord, do you know where you are sending me? This is the hometown of Jezebel, and they want my scalp. Why in the world are you sending me into the shadow of her hometown? You know, as I mentioned this morning, the brook Kerith was not the Samaritan Hilton, but at least it made a good hiding place. I mean, Elijah was from that area, and he probably knew every inch of that area. And so if Ahab was chasing him, Elijah could always escape into the mountains. He knew those things like the back of his hands, and he knew it so well. But Zarephath, he really probably knew nothing about it. And think about it, this isn't a big town. It's probably a small town. So when you come into this village, everybody knows that you're a stranger. And he probably has his face posted on every post office throughout Phoenicia there. Everyone is looking for him, and they want him. And if he introduced himself, he has the danger of being arrested. There could even be relatives of Jezebel living there for all that he knew. But that wasn't all. There is one more thing to God's commandment here. I want you to notice here in verse 9. He says, Go to Sidon, Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. And behold, I've commanded a widow there to provide for you. Now, that word commanded is the same word that was used earlier regarding the ravens. I've commanded the ravens to come and feed you. Now I've commanded a widow to come and feed you. And the word commanded there actually means appointed. In other words, God has set this in order. I've got this all planned out for you, Elijah. There's a widow who's going to take care of you. And so I picked out a poor woman that's about to starve to death, and she's going to be the one to take care of you. Everything's going to be okay. So if Zarephath didn't make any sense, this makes even less sense. But as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27, God has chosen the foolish things of the world, things that men think are foolish, to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world, and the despised. God has chosen the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are. And the reason, he says, is found in verse 29, so that no man may boast before God. God never wants us to forget that in every situation in life, he is the one who is taking care of us. And that's such an important lesson for us to learn, especially for those of us in this culture, in 21st century America, because we've learned to depend upon ourselves. The American way is, I am independent. I'm going to do this on my own. I can work through this. I can figure all my problems out. And sometimes, even within the church, many times we don't like turning to one another for help. And yet, Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 6, we're to bear one another's burdens. Now, how can we do that unless, of course, we're letting others know what our burdens are? We not only have to be there, and I think we're willing to do that for other people, but are we willing to be vulnerable? Are we willing to be the ones who say, this is my burden, and I need you to help me take care of that? Nobody likes to be a burden. We understand that. But we also have to recognize that we need help sometimes. And all the time, that help comes from God. We don't like to depend upon other people. We like that independent, I can take care of myself, I can provide for myself. But what God says to Elijah here is, don't ever forget that I am the one that takes care of you, whether it be through ravens or now it's going to be through this poor, starving widow. And so Elijah does exactly what God says. In verse 10, he arose and he went to Zarephath. Now, this would have involved a 100-mile trip as the raven flies. And Elijah would have had plenty of time as he's walking across this drought-filled area to see all kinds of different situations. And I have to wonder, as he's traveling, as he goes by this house over here, and he says, well, why didn't God choose that house? That looks like a well-to-do house over there. That looks like a place that maybe has some kind of well that maybe I could drink from. They're surviving, evidently. But as he passes through this, he's passing each and every Israelite town and finally ends up in this poor Gentile widow's house in Zarephath. You know, Jesus himself mentioned this when he was talking to those in the synagogue of his hometown in Nazareth. You remember in Luke chapter 4, in verse 25, as he stands up and after he reads from the book of Isaiah, he says, but I say to you in truth that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. Now I want you to look at the results of this when Jesus finished this lesson. If you skip to verse 28, and all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things, and they got up and drove him out of the city, and they led him to the brow on the hill in which their city had been built in order to throw him down over the cliff. That seems like a mighty strong reaction to a sermon about the widow and Elijah. And I'm hoping that this sermon topic will not provoke the same response this evening. I'm guessing that's why you have an escape door right here, in case you start throwing songbooks. But why would a simple story about Elijah stir up such animosity from Jesus' neighbors? Because what Jesus was really saying was that God sometimes finds greater faith among heathen Gentiles than he did among his own people. And that would have been insulting to those Jews of the first century who considered Gentiles to be nothing more than fuels for the fire of hell. Remember how upset Jonah was at the thought of going to preach to Gentiles over Nineveh? Well, then how do you think Elijah must have felt? That now he's going up there to be provided for by this Gentile widow. He is asked by God to be completely dependent upon a Gentile from a pagan town. And not just a Gentile, but a woman. And not just a woman, but a widow. And not just any widow, a poor, starving, destitute widow. As Elijah approaches the city gates, he found this woman gathering sticks, it says in verse 10. And he asked her for a drink and some food. He arose, he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called for her, and he said, please get me a little water in a jar that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. So she is gathering up these sticks, and he picks her out. Maybe the Holy Spirit points it out to her or whatever. He knows somehow that this is the widow. And he says, will you please go and get me a drink? And She doesn't seem to say a word. She's really willing to do that, even though she probably doesn't have much water herself. But as she's turning to go, and he says, and by the way, while you're at it, can you also get me a meal? Would you get me something to eat? And that seems to maybe just kind of turn her over the edge here, because she responds in verse 12, and she says, notice, as Yahweh, your God, not my God, but your God. I'm not serving this God who has brought this whole famine on this region here. I'm serving probably some other God. But as your God lives, she's swearing here, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar. And behold, I'm gathering a few sticks that I may go in and prepare for me and my son, that we may eat it and that we may die. Evidently, she's already starving, because she admits that this is her last meal that she had in her house. She's going to prepare this, feed her and her son, and then she's going to die. So, how is this better than the brook of Kerith with all the ravens? Elijah travels all this distance, and nothing seems to be any better. In fact, it's probably worse. There's no ravens here. But you know, oftentimes, that's the way that it is. Maybe you say, you know, my job really stinks, and my boss is just so hard to get along with. I'm just going to quit and go get a new job, and lo and behold, you get a new job, and your boss is twice as bad as the old one was. Nothing's changed. Or you say to yourself, I'm tired of living in this old house. I'm always fixing things. There's always problems. So I'm going to go get me a new house. And you go and you spend a lot of money, maybe go in further debt to get a new house. And you find the first time that it rains that it is leaking, and nothing has really changed. I've seen congregations from time to time switch congregations because there are problems within that church. And then they get to the other church, and guess what they find out there? There's still problems. In fact, maybe they are the problem. Nothing's changed. We often think, you know, if I could just change my circumstances, then things would be better. Then I would be faithful if my circumstances changed. Then things would be better. Don't count on it. You need to be content where you are and serve God. Or as the modern statement goes, bloom where you're planted. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Change isn't bad. I think sometimes we need to make a change. Sometimes we need a new job. I think sometimes we might need to change houses. And maybe there are some circumstances, certainly not the first option, but some circumstances where we need to change congregations. I can understand. But change doesn't always improve our outward circumstances. And that is the lesson that Elijah is now learning. So here's Elijah talking to this starving widow. And by the way, evidently she is a young woman here, I think. She only had one child, and it appears that that child is young, and that means that she probably had a very tragic life very early on, had lost her husband at an early age. So from all that we can tell, she doesn't seem to have any family that is there to help her out, or at least it's not mentioned here. Her food had dwindled, just like the brook of Kerith had. And all she had left was enough flour to make basically what we would probably call something like pancakes. And she would cook them, and then she and her son would eat them, and then they would die. That's her plan. But Elijah says something here that, as you read it in verse 13, almost seems kind of cruel. That Elijah says to her, do not fear, go, do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from it first, and bring it out to me, and afterwards you may go and make one for yourself and for your son. You take your last bit of food and you make something for me, and then you can have what's left over. Can you imagine a stranger showing up at your door and saying that? And that's all the food that you have? Okay, first feed me, and then if you have something, you go and make it for yourselves. That almost, like I said, seems cruel, but Elijah, understand, is acting on the word of God. You remember again what God said to him up in verse 9. Don't fear, do as, let me see, where was it? Back here to verse 9. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I've appointed a widow there to provide for you. God didn't say that a widow there would allow you to starve, and she's going to starve along with you. God promised to meet Elijah's needs, and so that's why Elijah is bold enough to make this request of this widow, because he's confident that God's going to keep his promise, that God's going to be able to do exactly what God said, that God's going to meet his needs and he's going to meet her needs, that God is not going to allow her to starve. And so Elijah made what appears to be a very harsh request here, but he is making it by faith, because what we saw this morning is God always keeps his promises. It doesn't matter if it's been 500 years, God is going to keep that promise. But it was also one that would require faith from her, because in verse 14 it says, "Thus saith Yahweh, God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty until the day that Yahweh sends rain on the face of the earth." Do you appreciate how much faith that it was required for this widow to do exactly what Elijah asked her to do here? And honestly, I'm not sure what possessed her to actually believe Elijah, that this stranger shows up, this foreigner makes promises to her based upon a foreign God that she doesn't know. Why would she use up her last bit of food and give it to Elijah? You know, it's hard to trust God, isn't it, when we only have a little bit? You know, when we have a lot in my possession, then I can give a lot to God and not be worried about it, because I've still got a lot left over. I'll be fine. I'll be taken care of. I can take care of myself. But at those times when you don't have much, it's sort of tempting, isn't it, to think, if I give to God first, well, how am I going to take care of myself? I've got to think about me first, and I'll think about what I can do for God after that. So I can imagine that this poor widow is struggling with these same thoughts here. But in the end, she did what Elijah asked her to do. And she went home and she got down to the bottom barrel. She scraped it out to get that last bit of flour. She turned over that jar of oil and she got every little last drop of that. She mixed it all together and kneaded it, and that's probably the only two ingredients that they had. She stoked the fire. She put it over there with a few sticks that she had. She took it out of the oven and she goes and she sets it before Elijah, and he eats. And guess what? There was enough for all three of them to go around. But here's the amazing thing. The next day she goes back into her pantry, and guess what happens? There's flour there and there's oil. And she must have been thinking to herself, wait a minute, now, didn't I just use up all of this? What happened here? She uses it then, and she makes another loaf of bread. And that day, the three eat of it. And the same thing happens each and every day. She keeps going back, and there's more flour, and there's more oil. And day after day, God provides the daily bread. And for months, Elijah and the widow were fed in that way. Verse 15 says that she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke through Elijah. And so once again, Elijah learned that God has a marvelous way of taking care of us. And through this time of drought, when everyone around them, no doubt, was struggling to have their needs met, Elijah and this widow and her son have their needs met by God. It wasn't a feast, understand that. I mean, they're not eating steak and potatoes here. But it was food, it was nourishment, and God was providing for their needs. But as often is the case in our lives, before things got better, sometimes they get worse. And suddenly something happened that took both the widow and Elijah by surprise. In verse 17, it says, "Now it came about that after these things, that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him." In other words, he died. And there's another crisis in Elijah's life, and more so in this widow's life. And that's sometimes what life is made up of, isn't it? One crisis after another. And you know what I'm talking about. That you get one thing squared away and all of a sudden something else falls apart. Or you get one car running, the other one dies. Or one doctor bill is cleared up, someone else in the family gets sick. That's just what happens. It never stops. And there just seems to be one thing after another. You've often heard it said, or maybe you've said it yourself, when it rains, it pours sometimes. When trouble comes, it seems to be in floods. And sometimes the great crises in life come after some act of commitment, when we've determined to do the will of God. There may be some area in your life where you've been struggling to do what God has commanded you to do. Maybe you haven't been as faithful as you ought to do, and you decide, I'm going to commit myself to the Lord. I'm going to turn my life around, and I'm going to do what the Lord's going to command me. And then my life is going to change. Everything's going to be fine after that. But it turns out it's not. I don't know how many times that there's been non-Christians that I've worked with who are in dire circumstances, and it has brought them to the Lord. But once they became a Christian, they thought, well, all of my problems would go away. I'll tell you, that's not the way it works, is it? In fact, sometimes the problems increase when you become a Christian. And you begin to wonder what's going on here. Here I'm doing God's will. I'm doing what He's told me to do. I've changed my life. Now I expect things to get better, but here all of a sudden they're getting worse. Somewhere we picked up the idea that doing God's will means that life will always go smoothly and there won't be any hard times or difficult circumstances, and that simply is not the truth. And so Elijah and this mother are confronted with this tragedy, and being human, they had to be thinking, what's going on here? I've done everything that God has asked me to do, and this is what we get for it. As a mother, she loved this boy. As you mothers can relate, you rock those babies to sleep. You nurse them from very early on. You remember the good times. You remember the first steps. You remember those laughs and those smiles. But now this child is gone. And I have to wonder if Elijah is not also hurt. Maybe not so much as the widow, but also he's mourning for himself, because no doubt he's gotten close to this young boy over the last several months that he has lived with them, probably played with him, maybe have become a father figure in the place of his father who had passed away. And now this child has passed away. Death is always hard to handle. The death of a child, that's especially difficult, isn't it? We expect the elderly to die, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. We don't like it, but we can accept much easier when someone in their 80s or their 90s passes away. But a child with his whole life, or her whole life, in front of them, that's just difficult to handle. We've all known situations like that. But for this widow, think about that. That would have been even more traumatic. For her, it meant a life doomed to loneliness. Most likely, she's not going to remarry. And it appears that she had no relatives to take care of her. There's no indication, at least in the scriptures, that she had any friends. Her entire life was probably wrapped up in her son, and now it's gone. It meant a life of hopelessness, because as long as she had a son, she knew even down the road, when she couldn't pick wheat or glean or anything like that for herself, that at least her son would be able to provide for her in her old age. They didn't have any type of some type of retirement system like we have in place, Social Security or anything like that. That was their security, their children in their old age. And now her only son is gone. He's dead. Someone whose child has died goes through a series of characteristic reactions. And not all bereaved parents suffer in the same way, but according to experts, most will experience many types of responses, like shock and denial and depression and loneliness and tearfulness and sleeplessness and loss of appetite, feelings of guilt and anger and hostility, or even a lack of energy. This widow of Zarephath may be feeling a number of those reactions, we're not told. But it was her feelings of guilt and anger and hostility that especially stand out here in the text. Because she responds by lashing out at Elijah. Notice verse 18. She said to Elijah, "What do I have to do with you, O man of God?" That's a title of a prophet. "You have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death." Elijah, it's your fault. Then none of this would have happened, you religious person, if you wouldn't have shown up. That's what she's saying here. Never mind the fact that they would have starved to death months ago if he would not have shown up. It was Elijah's God who had preserved her for all these months. And never mind that the flour and the oil had been miraculously replenished every single day. During times of crisis, we have the tendency, don't we, not to think very clearly. We think emotionally rather than logically or intellectually. And you would think that she would turn to the prophet and said, Elijah, listen, you and your God, you have helped me before. You've helped me all these months. Now I need your help again. But instead of turning to him for help, she turned away from him and blamed him for her son's death. And that seems to be a human characteristic, that when we face tragedy, our first reaction many times is that we want someone to blame. We want to point our finger and say, if you wouldn't have done this, if you wouldn't have come into my life, if you would not have not done this, then these things wouldn't have happened. But there's something else that's bothering the widow of Zarephath here. Because there's an interesting statement that's hard to understand, and she doesn't elaborate on it. But basically she says, have you come here to bring my iniquity to my remembrance, my sin? So at first she blames Elijah, but her deeper feeling was hostility towards herself. Which makes us wonder, what is this iniquity? What is this sin that's bothering her? Is it something general or is it more specific? Perhaps it's her past worshiping of Baal. Maybe it's some guilt of immorality. Did she feel guilty about her husband's death? Was she thinking, if I would have only done this, then he wouldn't have died? We don't know. Her sin could have been an enormous one, or in our eyes, maybe just one that's imagined, but it really doesn't matter. What does matter is that her sense of guilt separated this woman not only from her God, but also in God's representative here, this man of God, Elijah. And perhaps this mother's emotional explosion uncovered some guilt feelings that she would not have and had not had to this point admitted to herself. And this tragedy may be the first step towards really getting her life back together. And sometimes that's what it takes, isn't it? Sometimes somebody can hit rock bottom, and it's not until they realize how guilty they are that they turn back to the Lord. And what God was trying to do through this account is to bring Elijah and the widow to the end of themselves, just like he had done at Kerith with Elijah. And it's only when we come to the end of ourselves and to the end of our own resources, when we realize that we have used up all of our reserves, that we begin to realize our great need for a dependence upon the Lord. And sometimes the Lord takes us there because it's the only way that he can get our attention and make us realize what he can do for us. What a sad story this is, really. She's lost her husband. There's this drought, this famine on the land, and now she has lost her son. She's at the end of the road. This was the last straw for her. But Elijah comes to her and he says, give me your son. Look at verse 19. He says to her, give me your son. And then he took him from her bosom and he carried him up to the upper room where he was living, and he laid him on his own bed. And notice what Elijah does here. He pours out his heart to God like so many great men in the Bible do. He says, he calls upon Yahweh. And notice what he says. Oh, Yahweh, my God. Does that sound familiar? Isn't that Elijah's name? And isn't that his whole mission? Is not only to make Yahweh his God, as it already is, but to make everyone say this very same thing, that Yahweh would be all of theirs. He says, oh, Yahweh, my God, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I'm staying by causing her son to die? He's blaming God as well. Perhaps a better translation would be, Lord, why are you breaking this widow into pieces? She's taking care of me. Don't do this to her. Why are you allowing this to happen? In fact, why are you causing this to happen is what he basically says here. I understand, Lord, if you do this to me, but to her, why? And the question of why plagues us, doesn't it? All throughout life, especially as we go through difficulties. Why? It plagues Christians and non-Christians alike. And while the Bible gives many possible reasons for suffering, we need to be careful that we don't become so obsessed with the why that we neglect the who. Because when we're obsessed about finding out why, we take our eyes off of what God is able to do with us and for us, and we don't focus on God. Look at verse 21. Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and he called to Yahweh. And notice what he says again. "O Yahweh, my God," there's that name Elijah again. "I pray you, let this child's life return to him." Now keep in mind, as he is praying this, notice what he's praying for. He is praying for a resurrection. And to our knowledge, nowhere in history, nowhere in the Bible up to this point, has anyone been raised from the dead. Now, we learn later on that Abraham thought that God could raise Isaac from the dead, but he didn't have to, remember? God saved him in Genesis 22. So he is praying for something that has never happened before at this point. What a tremendous faith it was that Elijah offers this prayer. And then verse 22, it says, Yahweh heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. He did resurrect. And Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper room into the house, and gave him to his mother. The boy was raised from the dead. And Elijah takes this boy in his arms, and he comes downstairs to the room, no doubt, where this mother is still crying over the loss of her son. And can you imagine what it must have been like as Elijah takes this boy and lays him now in the arms of this grieving mother's? Tears are still rolling down her face, but not because the child is dead, but now they are tears of joy because this child has come to life. And Elijah says, "See, your son is alive." Notice the widow's response in verse 24. The woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Yahweh in your mouth is truth." You remember back up in verse 12 when Elijah first entered to Zarephath at the gate of the city and he asked for a piece of bread? And she took that oath. She identified him as a man of God, but she said, "By Yahweh, your God." But now she knew from experience Yahweh herself. Yahweh is now not just his God, but Yahweh is her God. And when Elijah brought her son back to life, she had to acknowledge that Elijah's God was not only the source of life, but he is the source of truth. And Jesus makes that connection, that the source of life is the source of truth. Remember, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And so her statement was not simply that she now believed what Elijah had been telling her was true, but then rather what he had been telling her was absolute truth. What she is saying is truth is found in Yahweh, your God. And that's why he is now my God. And so this woman, though she had seen all of this all along, her faith has been growing. And now it has grown to possibly its pinnacle. And so must ours. And that's what going through life's experience does for us. Here at Zarephath, Elijah learned another important lesson. Because as we studied this morning, at the brook of Kerith, Elijah learned, God will take care of me. But at Zarephath, he learned, God can use me to take care of others. So now, Elijah's ready to go out there and fulfill his mission, to teach people, to teach all of Israel that Yahweh is our God. It started with him. What he did, what he learned at Kerith was for him. What he learned at Zarephath was for her. And now that message must be taken to the whole nation. And so here's the question that we need to all ask by way of application this evening. When life gets tough, who am I really going to trust in? Where can I find my security? When terrible things happen to me, am I willing to trust that God is going to take care of me? Or will I only sleep good when I figured out a way of taking care of myself, when I get all my problems figured out? Because that's our tendency, isn't it? As long as we can see how things are going to work out, as long as we have a plan that gets us out of the rough times that we're experiencing, we're okay with that. If we can see the end from the beginning. We're big Colts fans, and we like watching games. And sometimes the our worship services on Sunday are at the same time. So of course our priority is the worship service. So we will set the record button and we will go watch the game afterwards. But I'm going to tell you, when you're watching the game for the first time and it is a close game, and at the end of the game, you don't know how it's going to end, there's some anxiety there because you're like, what's going to happen here? And that's what makes the game exciting, especially when your team comes out on top at the end. But when you go back and you watch the same game that maybe ends in a field goal at the last second, but you know how it ends, it's a lot less anxious, I guess you might say, anxious filled. There's a lot less anxiety involved because you know the end of the story. And I think that's the way that life is sometimes. It's difficult. And we're chewing our nails. We're wondering, how is all this going to end? But we understand God knows the end of this. And all we have to do is trust in him. He's going to win. He knows that the game is going to win, that we're going to win the game in the end. And as long as we can see how things are going to work out, as long as we are confident in that, we're okay. But we have to do in order to do that is have faith in God and trust him that everything is going to turn out. Brethren, it's not hard to praise God when you've got money in the bank. It's hard not to praise God when the boss just gives you a raise, or when your marriage is going well and your kids are doing fine and everything's right in the world. That's easy. But if all you have is a God of the good times, then you don't have Elijah's God. You don't have the God of the Bible. And you don't have a faith that will help you in hard times. What do you do when the boss says you're fired? What do you do when you run out of money, or when the doctor says, I'm sorry, it's cancer and there's nothing we can do about it? What are you going to do when your wife or your husband says, I'm finished with this marriage? What are you going to do when your kids are struggling, or when your child dies? In those moments, you really find out what kind of faith that you have. And God says, I want you to know that if you trust in me to get through those moments, when you don't see any possible way that things could work out, I want you to understand it's going to be okay. We've all heard the saying that when you get to the end of the rope, tie a knot and hold on. But as Christians, we have more to hang on to than just a rope. Because like Elijah, we worship a God who has shown time and time again his ability to take care of us, regardless of what happens. A God who has demonstrated that through the power of a resurrection. Not only did he resurrect this young boy, Zarephath, but also he raised his own son on the third day after he was crucified. And because of that, we can have all the confidence in the world to fully commit ourselves to him. So who are you going to trust? Yourself, your bank accounts, your security, the way your life is going? Or are you going to trust in God? Because God will never change, and he will always be there for you. This evening, if you've not put your trust in God, we encourage you to do that. Give your life over to him in simple trust and faith, realizing that he sent his son to die on the cross, but didn't stay in the grave. He was resurrected the third day, and because of that resurrection, we have the hope of being resurrected ourselves, but only if we are buried with him in baptism and resurrected, coming up out of the waters of life into a new life, one that is free of sin, one free of guilt, and now a life that is set on following him, no matter what happens, no matter what difficulty that we might go through. This evening, if you become a Christian and you've not been living the way that you ought to, we encourage you to come back to the Lord. Make your life right with God, or maybe you just simply need our prayers so that we can bear your burdens. Will you let us know that? Will you put your trust in Jesus and let him be the one who is the rock of your life? If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation anyway, why don't you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.